Hi, and welcome back to Risk Management. Today's talk is called Association is Not Causation. This is picking up on a theme we've been talking about so far, which is that when we're talking about risk, we need to talk first about causation and not about probability. When we talk about probability, we make the mistake that sometimes we think things that are uncertainties should have probabilities attached to them. But in the previous lecture, we saw that the best thing that math can do for probabilities for uncertainties is to say that uncertainties have a zero probability until they in fact become known, in which case they become risks, not uncertainties. So moving forward, we have to deal with this topic of, is an association some sort of statistical relationship or trend or pattern that we see between two different variables or more than two variables at any given time actually a causal relationship? Do we know that when you throw a ball and it hits a window, that in fact the window will break? And how do you know that? That's going to be the start of this lecture and a series of future lectures. So today, the title of the talk and what I want you to take home if you learn nothing else is association is not causation. Now in the last lecture when we talked about probabilistic causation, one of the things that we dealt with there was the fact that an uncertainty's probability was determined by the amount of discoverable evidence for it, or so the claim goes. I don't know the probability, somebody says, but if there's more evidence for an uncertainty, then the probability must go up. Well, we already saw that uncertainties should have a zero probability, but how about this second claim? Is this true? That we say that if we can discover more evidence for an uncertainty, it must be more likely to be true. This is going to be today's talk, because when we discover evidence for an uncertainty's truth, it tends to be in the form of an association. The problem is when we have associations, it's sometimes an illusion that it actually has a causal relationship. As Richard Feynman, a famous Nobel Prize winner in physics, once said, just because a good magician can do something that makes you right away jump to the conclusion that it's real phenomenon doesn't mean you should believe it. So what we want to take away from this today is that the law requires us to in fact find causation, to find scientific truth, to find financial knowledge, and not simply to rely on hunch, intuition, superstition, or mere guesswork. Here's an article, or I should say, here's a opinion from the Supreme Court in GE versus Joyner, one of the famous Supreme Court decisions dealing with evidence of a scientific nature. And in Joyner, the court said that evidence does not only have to be relevant when it's admitted to court as scientific testimony, but it has to be reliable. And this requirement will sometimes ask judges to make subtle and sophisticated determinations about scientific methodology and its relation to the conclusions an expert witness seeks to offer. Why do we do this? Justice Breyer answered, because we want to make sure that the truth will be ascertained. So there is a truth the courts recognize that we need to seek, and it's important to do so rigorously. And when we're studying risk, we really are studying science and finance, and we need to understand subtleties of it in order to manage risks effectively. There are two sources of illusion that we're going to talk about over the next series of lectures that have to be controlled in order to get knowledge that a risk actually exists. One of these are various forms of bias. The other is what's called chance. We'll talk about these in future lectures, but I just want to highlight now that we need to eliminate these as much as possible, or else they'll interfere with our understanding and knowledge of risk. Now, probability and statistics can control for bias and chance, except for certain circumstances like measurement bias, or sample or extrapolation bias, or error rates in chance. Don't worry about those things right now. I'm just flagging this for a future discussion, that even probability and statistics are not infallible at doing away with all bias and chance illusions that interfere with our ability to get knowledge of risk. What is a risk again? Remind ourselves. It's a probability of a harm caused by a stimulus or a cause. So we have a stimulus. Here's a little ball representing the stimulus. We have some effect, the harm, whatever it is we're talking about that has occurred, and there's a probability that that stimulus causes that harm. For example, the lifetime risk of cigarette smoking causing lung cancer is 8%. There are also what are called aggregated risks, which is just sort of summing up the probability that an effect will occur across all causes. The risk of divorce is 40%, the risk of dying is 100%, the risk of hurricanes in New Orleans is 38%, whatever that means. But I want to take us up now on today's lecture. The first step in trying to establish how we know a risk exists is to make sure we recognize the principle that association is not causation. Now, if this slide is not appealing to you because it's in blue color, but you want to see the same concept again, let me say this one more time. Association is not causation. I want to make sure that we walk away with that understanding. Let me give some examples. Here's an example of an association. The price of bread in England has gone up at the same rate as the rise in water levels in Venice for the last 3 centuries. That's a true fact. Does that mean that increases in flooding in Venice will cause British bread prices to rise? Well, that seems a little silly, a little strange. You might be scratching your head saying, by what mechanism? Well, maybe it causes the fields in Venice to flood, and so there's not as much bread grown in Italy, and so people were trading bread with England, and then the price of bread went up in England because there was a shortage in Italy. So you could create a story. But the fact is, this is merely a statistical association. Now, it's a strong one, and it's lasted for over 300 years. But that doesn't necessarily mean that this is, in fact, causation. Another example. Every time I go outside to wash my car, it seems to rain right after I finish washing. This does not mean that washing my car causes it to rain. Right? Now, you could tell a story where somehow washing my car caused water levels to drain, and it caused more condensate to form on the ground, and it caused more clouds to gather overhead, and there was some sort of butterfly effect where in fact it rained because of washing my car. But it's so remote, so tenuous a link, and so unproven and unknown that this is merely association. Another example, perhaps a little more subtle here. St. Petersburg, Florida has a higher cancer rate in it than New York City. This does not prove that living in St. Petersburg, Florida causes an excess rate of cancer. You say, well, why not? We'll come back to that in a future lecture. Be thinking about that. Why is it that we haven't proven simply by saying that St. Petersburg has a higher cancer rate that there's something in the city of St. Petersburg causing cancer other than in what happens in New York City? Can you think of that? We'll see it in the future lecture. Here's another example of association is not causation. Politics and baseball. It is a fact that the Democratic Party usually wins the White House when an American League team wins the World Series. So if you're a Cubs fan, bet on the Republicans, because maybe when the Cubs win, the Republicans will take office. Conversely, if you're a White Sox fan, then you're probably going to be a Democrat. Does this mean that when a baseball game is played that somehow it determines who's going to be president? Of course not. This is merely an association, not causation. Finally, let's consider an example of storks and baby population, a semi-humorous example. Here's a stork on the left and my cute little baby cousin on the right. And association is not causation in this case either, and yet we can find almost amazingly perfect correlations if we want to look at them between storks and baby populations. Check out this graph. Here's a picture based on year in the bottom axis. The horizontal axis is the year, and then in the vertical axis there are 2 different measures. Let me look at these myself. On the left-hand side is the population of brooding storks in Europe, from 1,000 up to 2,000, how many brooding storks there are. And then on the right-hand side axis, vertical axis, it's how many millions of babies are born in Europe in a given year. What you'll notice is that, very interestingly, these 2 curves are almost perfectly identically shaped. There's very little difference in the slope of the curve between these 2. One curve represents babies born, and the other represents stork populations. And notice that since 1965 until 1980, stork populations in Europe have been dropping. And baby populations in Europe, likewise, from 1965 through 1980, have been dropping. at almost exactly the same rate. In fact, so strikingly similar are the drops in populations of storks and babies that if we put it on a curve, sort of overlapping these two different variables onto one curve as a regression, we see that it's almost perfect correlation between the two. There's a coefficient called the R squared, and in this case, it's 0.982 is the correlation value here for R, which means it's almost 100%. Whenever there's a drop in baby populations, there's a drop in stork populations. And conversely, if there's an increase in stork populations, there's an increase in baby populations. It's almost perfect. Does this mean that storks bring babies? Of course not. Here again, we have the issue of association is not causation. One final example for today. Association is not causation. Let's say we took a random sample of people and determined that height is inversely related to how frequently one uses a pacifier. This does not mean that being shorter causes you to use a pacifier. Here there's a bias built in, isn't there? Babies are short. Babies use pacifiers. It's in fact what we will call a confounder. And that will be an issue that we will take up in a future lecture when we talk about confounders, something that are very, very important to rule out before we conclude that an association is in fact causation. So, this wraps up today's lecture. What I want to take away from it is the very simple fact that just because you can gather evidence, even in statistical form, that two variables seem to be moving in relation to each other, does not mean that one variable is causing the other to occur, or vice versa. And so we need to be very careful when we study causation, and therefore risks, since we know risks are based on causal analysis, and make sure that the association we are studying is proven to be causation before we call something a risk. That's it for today. Remember, association is not causation. Have a good day. See you on the chat boards.